Chapter 25. Which people have been the kindest to you in life? When I think about kind people, my mind immediately goes back to my childhood. There were several neighborhood families that come to mind. There was the Hancock family across the street with an only child, Linda. She was a little older and sometimes would babysit me. Even today we keep in touch and she calls me her little brother. Her dad worked as a truck driver for Chuckles Candy and would always bring big bags of that wonderful candy home to share with us. Then there were the Smiths just two doors down. Their son Gary and I played many days together either at my house or his. His parents, Roger and Alice, were always very kind to me. Joni and I went to celebrate Alice's 90th birthday last year. It was so great to talk with her. And there was my aunt and Uncle Josephine and Fred Kennelly. They lived next door with their four girls, all older than me. They always welcomed me over to listen to the girls play their 45s and have a glass of Josephine's fabulous iced tea and maybe a fried bologna sandwich. Fred even took me with them to the Indy 500 a couple of times. All of the families in our neighborhood were very friendly and close-knit. It was fun times back then. Many families had school-age children and we all played together at each other's houses. My first mother-in-law and father-in-law were very kind to me. That was Florence and Manson Coon. From the first moment Marilyn introduced me to them until they left us, they both treated me as one of the family. Mrs. Coon was a stay-at-home mother and always had a stately manner to her. I respected her very much. Mr. Coon had a high-level position with the C&EI Railroad. The family started in Evansville and got to Danville through a job transfer. I was always welcome in their house out on Denmark Road. They built that house when they moved here. Kindness was in their hearts too, as they allowed us to live there during their relocation to Park Forest with the railroad. They showed great kindness as they let me stay there after we lost Marilyn and until Mrs. Coon came back to Danville after Mr. Coon's passing. I am most thankful for Mrs. Coon helping me pay for the house I'm still living in on Poland Road. I want to single out one person from my old neighborhood that was very kind to me. That person was Fay Juvenal. He is in a picture in one of these chapters where he was our Little League manager. Even though he had two boys of his own, which were a few years younger than me, he loved to take me along on many adventures. When Fay worked for the county, he often drove the snowplow in our neighborhood. I remember more that once he would stop in front of our house with that big road grader and he would ask my mom if I could go with him for a while as he cleared the roads. That was a big treat for me, although his boss probably would not have approved. Besides taking me under his wing playing baseball, he would take me along on fishing trips around the area. I could write a book on this topic. Maybe I can narrow it down to 3 trips. They range from wading the river for catfish to carp fishing for profit. On one occasion, he took me and my cousin Donnie Treadway out to the Salt Fork River by the old Singing Bridge near Oakwood. There was a place in the river called Horseshoe Bend. That's where you could park your car close to the river, wade the river for about 1.5 miles, and end up very close to the car on the other side of the road. Very convenient. After wading and fishing with our fishing poles for a while without any success, Fay decided that it was time to ditch the poles and start hogging for catfish. I had never heard of this term before, but we soon found out what it was all about. Hogging was all about catching catfish with your hands, and not just little catfish. Fay probably had this in mind the whole time. He needed Donnie and me to pull this off. That part of the river had many big rocks in the water and along the edges, and that's where the catfish hang out. Fay would wade along to find a big rock that had places under it where there were openings. In those openings under the rocks is where the catfish were. He would reach down, sometimes going completely underwater, and reach in the holes. Soon he would come up for air and say, "Come over here and put your feet and hands over these holes. Donnie, you put your foot here, Denny. You put yours here." When we had all the holes plugged, he would reach in and pull out a big catfish. Amazing. At first we were scared to death to put our hands or our feet under those rocks, not knowing what kind of creature might be lurking under there. By the time we got around Horseshoe Bend and back to the car, we had an entire stringer full of big catfish. I have never done that since. Theme number 2. Fay picked me up on his way to a pay lake on the west side of Champaign called Kaufman's one early spring day. When we got there, we went into the office to pay for the day of fishing and to get our bait. It was windy that day, and as I opened the storm door on the bait shop, the wind caught it and slammed it open. That shattered the glass in the door as it hit the end of the chain stopper. The glass made a couple of pretty big cuts in my hand and wrist. The clerk at the bait shop was kind enough to patch me up with some band-aids, and off we went to catch some carp. Although it was a cold and windy day, we caught a trunkload of carp. That is what the pay lake was all about. They stocked it full so that you always caught loads of fish. Fay had a big wash tub in the trunk of the car, knowing that we would catch fish. We had that tub full within a few hours of fishing. On the way back home, I wondered why we didn't go back to our neighborhood, but instead went into town. I knew that carp was not known as a good-tasting fish, and soon I found out his plan. We went down on Washington and Van Buren streets where there were several taverns run by the blacks. Fay sold all those fish in a matter of a few minutes. We paid for the pay lake fees, bait, and then some. We were commercial fishermen. 3. How about an overnight fishing trip? It was probably a Friday night when Fay picked me up for this first-time overnight adventure. My parents knew Fay very well and knew that I would be safe with him. I probably could not have done something like this with anyone else. First, we had to get bait. So, with that same wash tub in the trunk, we set off down to a creek close to Fairmount, which was 20 miles southwest. Fay knew that there were plenty of crawfish in that creek. We got out by the bridge and Fay unloaded his seine net. I wasn't sure what to do, but soon Fay had me filled in. We got in the water with him on one side and me on the other, and we held the net in the water between us. We made a short pass up the creek, and we had hundreds of crawfish. We called them crawdads, in the net. It didn't take 10 minutes. Now off to mouth of Jordan. That was a section of the North Fork River that was north of Danville. By the time we got there, it was dark. The third of our party was there waiting for us. It was a friend of Fay's that owned the gas station in the Heights. We had to park along the roadside and climb over a fence to get to the campsite. We carried the tub full of crawdads and our fishing poles a short ways over to the riverbank. There we started a campfire and relaxed after all that preparation. As the night went on, so did the stories and the great companionship. The fishing was slow. I sat there watching all the glowing eyes across the river. There were plenty of nighttime creatures out there. After a few hours, we still had not caught a fish. After looking at the stars and the eyes for a while, I was getting a little restless, so I thought I'd liven things up. I said the problem is that we are not smoking the bait, so I baited up and held my bait over the smoking fire for a few seconds, then cast into the river. I immediately caught a fish. That got my buddy's attention right away. It wasn't 5 seconds before they both reeled in and held their bait over the fire. It must have been just a fluke because we still were not catching fish. As the sun came up, I could see my surroundings for the first time. I didn't realize that in that part of the river, it was more like a small stream. I had been casting my bait way too far and probably landing on the other bank most of the time. It was a great experience, though. Fay went on to be the park superintendent at Kickapoo State Park. His sons Scott and Daryl are still around the area. Joni thought that this topic was a good place for me to talk about her. Well, kindness is not the level of description I think of when I think of her. It is more on the level of loving, compassionate, caring, giving, and all the rest. There will be another topic for her.